Hi friends, my name is Gloria and welcome back to another video. Happy December. Today I'm going to be doing my November wrap-up, which is talking about all of the books that I got to reading in the month of November, and I will be touching on two particular areas that I focused on: historical fiction and nonfiction, which are my favorite things to read. I read a ton of good books and I'm excited to jump into it. November held two readathons that I was participating in. The first one being Historathon, hosted by Acrylic Reader and Lindsay's Little Library. It was all about historical fiction reads, and that was really the first 10 days of November, so I read quite a lot of historical fiction, and then the last part of the month I read a ton of nonfiction for Nonfiction November, of course. So I'll start with historical fiction because I read most of these at the start of the month. The very first book that I'll start with is Yellow Wife by Sadeqa Johnson. I heard really fantastic things about this one percolating on the internet on BookTube. This was a fantastic read. I ended up giving it 4 stars, but this might be closer to a 4.5. It follows an enslaved woman who was living at a jail in Richmond, Virginia that was owned by a very mean white man, and she ended up becoming his wife and having kids with him, and it just follows all of her trauma and heartache that she experienced in her life. It was very sad but beautifully written and a really fantastic story. Really enjoyed this one, and this is actually the one that I voted for in the Goodreads Historical Fiction Choice Awards. I didn't read all of the books, but based on the ones that I have read in that category, this one was the winner. Speaking of the Goodreads Choice Awards, the next book I read in November was The Four Winds by Kristin. I finally did it. I said I was gonna read this ever since, I don't know, like March or something, whenever the book came out. And boy, this book, I actually gave it 3 stars, which means I still liked it, but I did not love it. And I think it just was so depressing. This book is set during the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression in the US. The whole book just feels so hopeless and sad. I think that's what really brought it down for me. Is I don't mind sadness and I don't mind grief and heartache, but there needs to be hope. There needs to be a light at the end of the tunnel, and this book really didn't have any light at the end of the tunnel. It was just sadness and heartbreak over and over and over again. That's what really brought it down for me, but I totally understand why people would be sucked into the story. It follows the main character and her primary relationship with her daughter, as well as her husband, who then ends up leaving her. It's really a survival story, surviving during the Great Depression, trying to find work, trying to eat, and then it really shined a light in people who were trying to unionize and people who were trying to take a stand and actually get fair working wages. So there's a little bit of like politics going on behind the scenes in this book. Overall, enjoyed it, but definitely wasn't a favorite read like I thought it would be, which is unfortunate. Speaking of the Dust Bowl, I picked up Out of the Dust by Karen Hesse. This is a middle grade Newbery Honor winner, a free verse novel, and I really enjoyed this. I actually gave this 4 stars. I thought it was beautifully written. It was also very, very sad. It follows this young girl whose mother died in childbirth, and it's really her surviving and her father working through that grief, and also living during the Dust Bowl on the Great Plains where there's just nothing. No plants are thriving. The animals are dying. People are dying. It's just terrible living conditions. And it's this one young girl's journey through that and living through that, and I really enjoyed this one. Another middle grade I picked up in November is Stella by Starlight by Sharon M. Draper. I picked this one specifically for Chantel's Read Your Bookshelf Challenge, was to read a book with a night scene on the cover. This story follows a girl named Stella who wants to write, and she struggles with writing about very hard things that her small town in North Carolina is experiencing, particularly the terrors of the Ku Klux Klan on the Black community in that town. Overall, I like this, but wasn't a favorite, and I gave it 3 stars. Another one that I read for Historathon is The Tattooist of Auschwitz by Heather Morris. This is a very popular book. It's kind of everywhere on historical fiction, and I really felt like I needed to get to it. And I was so disappointed in this book. This was not a good book at all. This one was just like uncomfortable to read. I was like cringing a lot because it felt like there was this forced love story set in the middle of Auschwitz concentration camp, and I just wasn't there for it. It is based on a true story. Like, the characters in this book were real people, and that was how they met and how they fell in love and then survived World War II. So even though it seemed unrealistic in this story, it did actually happen, which is why I like boosted up to 2.5 stars. Really, this read was closer to like a 1.52. I just really did not enjoy it. Didn't like the characters, didn't like the forced romance aspect to it. And I think since its publication, it's also had some controversy around it, how the author put in certain things in the book that really weren't true to the story, and how the living children of the main character of this book didn't agree with what the author did. But I don't know all the details surrounding that. I maybe am still glad that I read it just because it is so hyped, but this is a prime example of a completely overhyped historical fiction that really was not well written and not well told, and just kind of like a cringy historical fiction story. So I would avoid if I were you, but you could read it and make up your mind yourself. I know a lot of people still enjoy it. Now moving on to another hyped historical fiction that I loved is Orphan Train by Christina Baker Kline. This is also very popular in the historical fiction booktube world, and boy, this book did not disappoint. I gave it 5 stars, loved it. This also follows true historical events of thousands and thousands of children that were sent into the Midwest to be adopted, but really they became indentured servants, and that was called the Orphan Train. And this was happening in the late 1800s into the mid 1900s. This book follows one particular girl that went on this orphan train, got moved around from home to home to home, experienced some intense trauma and heartache, and then the second timeline is her as an old woman telling her story to a younger woman in foster care, and they establish a friendship during this book. This was heartbreaking, but like I mentioned, I need still hopeful. There was very, very sad, traumatic moments in this book, but there was light at the end of the tunnel, particularly because we know that this woman survived, given that she's telling her story in her old age, and she's well off and wealthy, and so she did make a life for herself and was able to kind of come out of her like destitution and the life that she was kind of set to live. Loved it. Definitely making into my top books of the year list. And finally, for historical fiction, I read Between Shades of Grey, the graphic novel by Ruta Sepetys. This is a spoiler for an upcoming book haul, but I was gifted this book as well as another one by Mark Sullivan, and there was no note inside. So someone sweet sent me this via Amazon, and I so appreciate it. If it's you, please let me know. But I was gifted this and I absolutely love it. I gave it 5 stars. This is a graphic novel adaptation of the original novel written by Ruta Sepetys. It is a young adult historical fiction, but it follows a young Lithuanian girl and her family being sent to Siberia to work at a labor camp, and it is also mostly a story of survival and heartache. But the original story and book I loved, and I also loved this lovely graphic adaptation. All right, let's move on to nonfiction. I had a particular plan for Nonfiction November, and I, for the most part, completed that plan. But then the Goodreads Choice Awards came out, and I sort of detoured a little bit and read some nonfiction graphic novels because I wanted to read more of them for voting in the graphic novel category on Goodreads. I actually ended up voting for this one, historical fiction, because this one was the best one I read, but I'll mention the 3 others that I read in November that were nonfiction. The first one being Run, Book 1 by John Lewis. I read the 3-part March series in October and really enjoyed it. That was all about the civil rights movement, particularly the Freedom Bus Riders marching in Selma and the March on Washington, and John Lewis's role in the civil rights movement, and those were really well done. And this is the continuation of the story right after the Voting Rights Act was written into law, and I actually ended up giving this one 3 stars. I found it a little bit boring because this is more politically heavy and having to do with different characters that were involved trying to like run for office, and how Black activists were trying to get more of a foothold into like the political movement to actually make changes. It was still well done. I still enjoyed it. It just wasn't as compelling to me as the original March series. I then picked up Wake, the Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts by Rebecca Hall, and this was a bit of a disappointing read. I thought that this would be a lot more interesting and that I would learn a lot, but the reason why this fell short for me and I ended up giving it 2 stars was that I thought this was gonna more focus on the actual women who led slave revolts during the time of slavery, but this was more of the author's journey of uncovering these events. And I just found that perspective really weird to read. Like, we just really followed the author, who is a lawyer, trying to uncover court documents and sifting through and reading court documents and really trying to piece together historical moments that were really vague and really untold and never really written down in history. And so she kind of imagined what those slave revolts could look like, but really the main focus of this book was the author's researching through old court documents. And I just found that really boring and not compelling or engaging in any way, so I was pretty disappointed in this book. And the last graphic novel that I read in November is And Now I Spill the Family Secrets, an illustrated memoir by Margaret Kimball. This was a very interesting read. I ended up giving it 3 stars because I did like it overall, but again, it just wasn't a big standout. But this memoir takes a deep dive into one family and a lot of the mental health issues that exist in that family. So Margaret, the author, is telling her story of how her mother tried to commit suicide, and then she's at the same time uncovering maybe why that happened. And she did her due diligence by diving into old family photos and interviewing her different family members. She uncovers that her mother has bipolar disorder, and then her grandmother and great-grandmother also had mental health issues, and then her brother starts exhibiting mental health behavior issues as well, particularly thinking that everyone is watching him and we're part of a simulation and the government's out to get him, and he's becoming very paranoid. And so this book touches on a lot of those mental health things that came up in her family. I just kind of felt like this reading experience was taking taking a deep dive into one particular family, but there was no really conclusion or resolution or kind of main point. It was really, I guess what the title says, just a woman writing about the dysfunction that her family has and all of the problems that existed and the different relationships between her and her siblings and her stepmom. And there's just a lot of brokenness and dysfunction and sadness in this family, and it was really vulnerable and interesting to read about. So maybe this would be closer to a 4-star because it was a really good book, but I just didn't love it as much as I would have liked. If you're at all intrigued by how mental health exhibits itself and family dysfunction, this would be an interesting read for you. And now let's wrap up the books that I read for the Nonfiction November 4 prompts that A Book Olive created for the month. I'll start with industry, and I picked up American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption by Gabrielle Glaser. This was an excellent read. I gave it 5 stars. I loved this book. Very, very fascinating. This book starts out with one man who's dying of a terminal illness who was adopted, and he's on the hunt to try to find his birth mother. And then it jumps into his birth mother's story and how she got pregnant, her relationship, her family life, all the events that transpired to her giving up this baby for adoption. And this book jumps into the historical context of what was happening with adoption and just with family life, with culture at large, really during the mid-1900s. And if you're at all interested in this subject matter, I would highly recommend. Next up, another 5-star nonfiction read for me was Will by Will Smith. This is his memoir that just released in November, and I actually purchased this book off of Libro FM and listened to this as an audiobook, which is the way this book was meant to be consumed. Will Smith narrates the story himself. He narrates the book exquisitely. It easily moved up to the best audiobook experience I have ever had. The production is next level. There's parts of it that he raps, that he sings. He has different voices for all the different people in his life that he's talking about. The audiobook experience alone was 5 stars. His actual life story was also really fascinating. He goes through his childhood, growing up, the relationship with his abusive father, what it was like to grow up in Philadelphia, how he got into the rap scene, how he moved to LA and started his TV and film career, his relationships, his love life, his relationships with his children, and overall it was incredibly well told. If you're at all a fan of him, I would highly recommend pick this up, and I strongly encourage you to listen to the audiobook because there's so much missed if you just read this. I think if I just read this physically, it would have been more like a 4-star read, but because of the audiobook experience and the way he told his own story was 5 stars. It really felt like me and Will Smith were just sitting in my living room on the couch and he told me his life story. It was so good. For treatment, I read Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness by Catherine Cho. This was a really fascinating memoir. It follows Catherine, who experiences postpartum psychosis. 80% of women experience postpartum depression, which is quite common, but postpartum psychosis is uncommon. And this book really reads like a fiction book because it is so fast-paced. The book starts off with her in a psychiatric ward, and then it's really her journey of uncovering what happened to her and what led to her psychosis. So you're going through the book with her in the psychiatric ward, as well as jumping back in time to hear about the trauma she experienced in childhood, how she met her husband and their relationship, her relationship with different members of her Korean family, and kind of like the pressures and superstitions that exist in that culture. It was really well done, really fascinating. I ended up giving this book probably like a 4.25, a really interesting look at mental health. I think the slight part that brought it down for me just a little bit was especially towards the end, when you get to the point of her actual moment of psychotic breakdown, you are just sitting with her in that moment, and it feels very repetitive because she feels like she's in hell. She's experiencing hallucinations, paranoia, just complete manic breakdown of her mental state. It was hard to read and kind of uncomfortable to read, and I just felt like it went on a little bit too much and excessively, that particular moment of the book. But overall, very, very interesting. And then for our collection, I originally intended to read Word by Word by Kory Stamper, and I started to, and I got 60% of the way through of this book and I DNF'd it. I just couldn't do it. I was so bored and like my mind and eyes just glazed over. I was mainly listening to this as an audiobook. I tried to pair the both together. I tried to just read it physically. I tried, but it didn't work for me. This book sounds really interesting. Kory Stamper is an editor at Merriam-Webster's Dictionary, and she is a lexicographer, which is a new word for me, but mainly her career is defining words for the dictionary. And at the very beginning, I'm a bit intrigued. She seems witty and funny and charismatic. The main issue I had was that she brings up particular instances where defining words may be hard. So she brings up an example of like the word take, and then she spends a whole chapter going through the cognitive process of what it takes to define that word for her job. It was overly detailed, and I could care less about grammar and like words and stuff, and she just goes on and on and on and on and on. I can 100% see people who might have English or literature degrees or really are word people that love Scrabble and love to nerd out about all things words and linguistics, totally understand why they would enjoy this book. It wasn't for me. I honestly felt way too stupid to understand anything that was said in here. And this book felt a bit pretentious, like because she's a dictionary writer, she uses a lot of big words that I'm like, I have absolutely no idea what the heck you're talking about. The one positive thing about this book that I got out of it was it really made me think about my reading. And I think one thing that I want to try to do next year in 2022, throughout my reading, when I come upon a word that I do not know the definition of, I want to write it down in a journal that maybe by the end of the year, I will have a whole journal full of words that I learned that year. And I feel like that will be a fun thing that I can take away out of my reading experience. All that to say, this book was just not the book for me personally, but I totally understand why it works for others. And then the last book that I'll be talking about that I read in November is The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are by Libby Copeland. I picked this one particularly because I needed to fulfill the Buzzwordathon prompt to read a book with Lost in the title, and I wanted to read a nonfiction, and I needed another word for collection because I DNF'd word by word, and this is all about collecting DNA. I ended up giving this book 3 stars because I also found myself a bit bored at times, but if you are someone who is really interested in the DNA testing world, like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, or if you're adopted or have a background of not knowing like where you come from, I totally understand why this would be super fascinating. My family's quite boring. I know exactly where my parents, grandparents, and all of them from. If I took a DNA test, I don't think I would find out anything interesting. This book covers a few people and a few examples of one particular family finding out that their father was switched at birth. This book also looks at consumer DNA testing as a whole and all of the implications and problems that can arise from it. So yeah, like I said, if you're interested in that, this would be a great reading experience. For someone who isn't like 100% invested in that, I found it slightly boring at times, but overall was still a good book. All right, friends, those are all of the books that I read in the month of November. It was a great reading month overall, a lot of 5-star books, some new favorites for sure. Please let me know what your absolute favorite book in November was, and if you have anything else to say below about any of the books I read or anything at all, leave a comment down below. Appreciate you guys watching and tuning in, and I'll see you guys in another video soon. Bye.